In this video, we are going to create and texture a simple rock using Blender and InstaMat. We are going to sculpt this, get a low poly version and unwrap that. Then we will export the meshes to InstaMat, and there we can look to bake the different maps required for texturing and work on the model using layers and masks. If you want to skip to the texturing part of the video, you can go ahead to the timestamp on the screen. So for this project, I'm working on Blender 5.0, which was released this week. We will be using the OR brush pack for Blender. It was originally made for ZBrush by Michael Vicente. I hope I pronounced that right. And it is free to get on the Stylized Station Gumroad page. You can check the link in the description for that. So go ahead and download it. If you are familiar with using custom brushes and adding them to the asset browser, you can skip the next part and go for the sculpting. In the downloads, you will have your zip file containing the icons, textures, and the blend file with the brushes. You can extract the folder anywhere onto your hard drive. I'm putting it on my desktop in a folder called OR brushes, so it's easy to navigate to. Now I have Blender open with a default scene. To use the brushes in Blender, if you're using an older version of Blender, you could drag and drop the blend file into the 3D viewport and select append and open up the brushes and select the ones that we need. Just hit append and the brushes will be added into the file and you can start using them. But with the changes to the Blender sculpting mode and how brushes work, this is not the ideal way of doing this. You can get it to work like this by making them as an asset locally, but there's a better method. Since Blender added the asset browser for the brushes, we can access the custom brushes by adding them to the brush asset library. This way you can access them across all projects and don't need to import them every time. I also found that this works slightly better in terms of performance compared to the older versions of Blender with appending them, as this way it doesn't load the blend file. So let's look at adding the brushes to the asset browser. We first need to open the OR brushes blend file. Now make the inspector larger. On the top you have the display mode. Change that to Blender file. Now this shows everything in this blend file, like the brushes, images, meshes that are available in the file. So expand the brushes and select all the OR brushes. These have the prefix of A here. Right click and select mark as asset. Now these should be added into the asset library. So you can go to the sculpt mode and change the asset library to current file so you can see the ones we marked here. As you can see, we have the brushes, but they don't have the icons and we need to assign them. Split the viewer and you can change it to asset browser. Select current file here as well to see only the brushes. Click on the gear icon or hit N on your keyboard to open the side panel. Here you can select the brush and assign the current icon in the preview. I'm just going to speed this up. With all of the brushes assigned, we can just save this and let's create a new blend file. Now to access the brushes in other files, go to Edit, Preferences, and under File Paths, you can add the OR brushes folder to the asset library. Just save the preferences and close this. Now if we go to sculpting, we can select the OR brushes and all of the brushes should be available and working. With the brushes set, we can start working on the rock sculpting. Alright, now to start sculpting, I like to take a UV sphere. You can also start with a cube, as there are many different shapes of rocks and you can make it look however you want. Just take whatever you feel is appropriate according to your reference. Don't worry about the topology, and UV spheres are not great for sculpting, but for this situation we are going to be slicing the mesh anyway. So let's head on to the sculpt mode. Here in the sculpt mode, we will start slicing the sphere to make it feel like an organic rock. For this we can use the trim tools. I like to start with the line trim. With this you can start cutting into the mesh. And the side of the line that is dark is what is going to be trimmed. Now if you start the line at an awkward position, you can move it using spacebar. Once you are fine with the location, release spacebar and you can still adjust the angle. Release the left mouse button to make the cut. Another thing is, if you draw the line and it is cutting on the wrong side, you can use F to flip where the mesh is going to be cut. You can also snap the angle of the line using Control. I believe it's an increment of 5 degrees. You can see all of the operations you can do at the bottom of the screen. One more problem you would run into when using the trim brush. Let me just take a cube so that it's easier to demonstrate. In certain angles, the cut is slightly different from what we see with the line. And also, in some cases, depending on the view and topology, it simply doesn't cut the mesh. So to avoid this problem, we can change the extrude mode on the top here from fixed to project. Now we should be able to make the correct cuts without running into any problems. Now with this trim tool, we are just gonna make some cuts. I'm gonna speed this part up and complete the base for the rock. If you cut it too small to work with, you can use the scale tool to make it bigger. This is better than scaling the mesh in object mode, as you will need to apply the scale with Ctrl A, or else the sculpt brushes will act weird. And scaling in sculpt mode, you don't really have to worry about it. So I'm just going to rotate it and scale it non-proportionally to get the look that I want. And we can continue cutting away at the rock. Next, for some detailing, first I like to make some shape cuts to break up the surface. By default, when you make a line cut, the line is actually endless. So even if you make a small line, it still cuts everything. If we turn on the limit to segment option on the top, now the cut ends where we stop the cursor. This is nice to add some extra details. I also like to use the polyline trim. make sure it is on project, and we can make a couple of cuts. Now take the brush and we can start sculpting. First, we need to increase the resolution as this is still low poly. You can either do it with the dynamic topology or with the remesh. For this tutorial, I will just use remesh as it is easier to manage and work with. Hit R on your keyboard and you can adjust the voxel density. You can also manually type it in on the top here with the voxel size. I'm going for a pretty high resolution, around 300 to 400,000 vertices. You can hit Ctrl R to finalize the remesh once you have the resolution fixed. Now we don't need to see the face sets, so just turn it off in the sculpt overlays on the top. With the essential brushes, I like to start with the trim brush and the scrape brush. Scrape is nice to flatten these sharp borders. And trim is just a much stronger brush and can be used for more intense flattening and also for some surface damage. Trim can also be used to extend the cuts we made with the poly trim for a more organic crack damage look. If you make any mistakes, avoid using the smooth brush. Just use the trim or scrape to try and fix it. Because smoothing is going to take away the look we want for these kinds of rocks. You can definitely use the smooth brush if you are trying to create riverbed rocks which have that smooth look after being polished by the flowing water over time. But for the rocks that we normally see on the land, it would not make that much of sense. At least not for the rocks that we are trying to sculpt here. Now here, I was trying to use the trim brush and use the cuts we made earlier to extend the cracks. If it ends up getting wide, you can use the trim brush with control to fill up the path, and it will get it to the level of the plane where we started the stroke. This can be used to create some nice interesting damage. Continue using the scrape and trim and also add more damage with the trim. Now let's use the ore brushes for some more detailing. I also like to mention the ore flatten edge project. This brush also works really well and you can use it along with the trim. It gives a slightly different look, but you can use it in the same way to add more damage. It's a bit more rough. You also have the Orb Extreme Polish brush, which is a bit smoother. So if you want a slightly softer look, but still want some flatter planes, you can use this instead of the smooth brush. I also like to use the flatten edge project on the flat surfaces. It gives a more organic look. And it also helps make the edges irregular instead of having straight lines. We can turn on cavity to see the details a bit better. Next, we can add surface details using the Orb rock brushes. We have 3 here. Actually turn off the cavity when working on details. Increase the strength to your liking using Shift F, or on the top here where you have the strength control. You can use either of the two brushes depending on which one you like better. I'm using the rock details for this one. And the rock noise can be used for something that is a bit more realistic and highly detailed. Trying to mainly add the rock details on flat surfaces to introduce some breakup. We can use the trim or orb flatten for some final adjustments and detailing. I also like the scrape multiplane to define some plane changes, and then use the trim brush to flatten them. It's easier to do than just using the trim brush in some cases. So for this we mainly use the scrape and trim brushes from the defaults. For the ore brushes, we just use the Ore Flatten Edge Project, Extreme Polish and the Rock Detail brush. So about 5 brushes, that's pretty much all you need for this. Sculpting can be as complicated or as easy as you make it to be. It's more important to learn the fundamentals of sculpting and a good study of what you're trying to make, compared to knowing every single tool or brush. Realistically, you'll only need 5 to 10 brushes that you will use regularly for everything, and a couple of specific ones for the model that you are trying to sculpt for the details. And that will do it for the rock sculpting. You can move on to getting the low poly now. With the sculpted rock, I'm just going to name this rock HP for high poly. Let's not forget to save the file. Should have done that at the start, but it's a good thing that Blender didn't crash. Again, we can turn on the cavity to see how it works. Also, we don't want to see the faces, so right click and hit Shade Smooth. This amount of details is enough for the rock as we are trying something stylized in this video, but you can definitely work on it more. Go to the overlays and turn on statistics to keep a track on the poly count. Next, duplicate the rock with Shift D, right click to leave it in place. Hide the high poly and change the name for the duplicate to LP for low poly. And to make the low poly version, for this rock it's a simple process as we don't really care much about the topology. So select the rock and in the modifiers tab, under generate, add the decimate modifier. We can just leave it on collapse and decimate it. Now we have a really high poly mesh here, so don't slide the ratio value as it may crash Blender depending on your CPU. And mine is a pretty old chip, so let's type it in manually. I'll go for a value of 0.2 as it's a better idea to decimate this in increments instead of going for a really low number and having Blender calculate all of that at once. Hit Ctrl A and apply the modifier. Now the poly count is lowered from 360k words all the way down to 72k. This way it's easier on your system. So let's repeat the process till we get a really low poly count. Okay, now that we have around 3k words, we can turn on the wireframe under the overlay to get an idea of how that looks. This is still too much, so let's decimate it again. Now that we have around 600 words, it's totally safe to just use the slider and not really worry about crashing. Even at 3k it would have been fine, just don't want to do it at a really high poly count. I'm trying to lower it to the point where it's really low poly, but we still have the geometry for the ridges so that it doesn't look flat from some angles. You can go lower or higher, it really depends on what you will be using this model for. Apply the decimate modifier and that should do it for the low poly. Now I know it just looks like a blob, but we will capture all of the high poly details in the normal map. You can set shade flat to see the shape of the rocks, and we still have the ridges and the cuts that we need. But turn on shade smooth again for texturing. Now to UV unwrap this, go to edit mode, select everything with A and hit U on your keyboard and you will have the UV mapping menu. Angle based won't really work for this as we don't really have any seams and we get an error, but we don't really need to worry much about that. Just select the smart UV project option instead and Blender will automatically unwrap the model. It's not perfect, but it should work for this scenario. You can try to arrange the islands. Also, these small bits aren't that great, but it's not a big deal as we can use the triplanar projection in the texturing software. The only problem we would run into might be when we try to use any blurs. Now we have the low poly and the high poly mesh overlapping each other, and we can now export these to bake and texture the rock. I just like to select the two and hit Ctrl A and apply all transform. You can also just do the rotation and scale. Now make sure the model has the correct or approximate real world scale. You can check that in the N panel by hitting N on the keyboard. This is about 3 meters in height and I do want it to be a fairly large rock. This is important as scale does affect baking in InstaMAT. We can select the low poly, go to File, Export, FBX. I'm just going to select a folder and call it Rock LP. Make sure to turn on Limit to Selected Objects, so we are only exporting the low poly model. You can adjust the scale when exporting here. I will later show the difference this causes in baking when you export at a 0.1 and a 0.01 scale. I only noticed this in the curvature map, so keep a note of this property when exporting. And we already applied the transform, so don't worry about this. We don't have any animation, so just turn it off. Export the FBX and that should do it. Now do the same thing for the high poly. With the two meshes exported, we can go ahead and open up InstaMAT for baking and texturing. I have InstaMAT open. Let's create a texturing project. Give it a name. We will select the low poly FBX file we exported for the mesh. Don't bake the mesh on creation as we will do it manually. On the left, we have the layering project editor. On the top, we have all the channels that we can use with the layers, and we can set the bit depth and the color space. On the bottom, we have the mesh section. These are the maps that we bake, like the normal map, ambient occlusion, and curvature. And if you already baked the mesh maps in other softwares, you can add them here. But for this, we will bake them right here in InstaMAT. Also on the top, we have the 3D viewer and the image viewer. We can keep both of them open to inspect the bakes once we complete them. And you can also change the split orientation from vertical to horizontal. Okay, now let's open the baking tab on the top here. And we get this window with all of the bake settings. The target mesh is the low poly mesh we have in the project. The source mesh is where you add the high poly sculpt. So let's add the high poly FBX we exported. For the baking engine, you can either select the CPU or GPU depending on the hardware you are running. Since I have a discrete graphics card, I'm just going to choose the GPU. Next is the bake resolution, where you can choose the image size for your bakes. Now if you don't see the option for the higher resolutions like the 4K or the 16K, open up the preferences and here you can change the maximum execution size. Note that you will have to restart InstaMAT to apply any of the changes, so save the package before you do that. And once it restarts, you have the option for the higher resolution. For this project, I will just leave it at 2K. For super sampling, 2x is fine. You can increase it, but it will slow down the baking time and increase the memory consumption, so be careful with this. The next option is to store the result in the package. So the baked image files will be saved inside the package and you can export them later. Or you can turn this off and choose an output part to save the images onto the drive, which is quite useful if you want to edit the images in an image editor out of InstaMAT and you can easily update them. I will just leave them to save in the package. Then you have the image file name and you can add other information here. You can also see the preview of the name below. Next, you can choose the file type. PNG is fine. You can use TIFF or Targa, which also work well for the textures depending on what you need. Then below you have some baking settings. You can choose by mesh name if you have multiple objects in the FBX, granted that you name the high poly and the low poly with the proper suffix, and you can change the suffix here. Just choosing all source mesh as we have a single mesh in the file. You have ray length that you can adjust in case you are getting artifacts. As of right now, I don't believe there is a visual way to see this on your 3D mesh. In Substance Painter and Marmoset Toolbag, you can see a kind of a cage for the ray lengths and adjust it to avoid artifacts caused by clipping. So I do hope they add that in the future, as that would make it much easier to figure out what is causing any problems in the baking. and it just makes the baking experience much smoother in my opinion. And down you also have the option for the cage, which you can choose in case you made one in your 3D modeling software. Okay, those are the main settings for the baking. Now let's look at the active bakers. This is where you select which maps you want to bake. By default, InstaMat adds all of the ones you need, but I just like to do each map one after the other so it's easier to manage if anything goes wrong. And it just takes more time to bake multiple maps at once and have to rebake them. So first let's do the normal. Is the tangent space normals, not the world space normals. We don't have any additional settings, so we can just bake them. And there you have all of the details from the high poly sculpt. Now you can go to the package, under assets and images. You can select the normal map that we just baked. Double click on it to see it in the image viewer. And looking at this, we don't really have any artifacts on the bake. If you do have any, you can try adjusting the array length. Next, let's bake the position and the world space normals. These are great to have if you plan on using masks like the gradient mask. There you can see the world space normals and the position map. Next, we need to do the curvature. And this adds an extra panel for the curvature settings instead of just being a drop down, as the curvature map shares its settings with the bevel normal map. Now, curvature maps work in an interesting way that took me a while to figure out, as it is dependent on the scale of the object that we imported. I'm going to showcase the bakes with different scales for the object, but if you export it in the method that I showed you in the video, you can just do it once. Let's just bake it and see what we get. If we look at the curvature map, we have some details, but it's very light and we can barely see anything. Let's open the baking. And for the curvature strength, let's increase the value and try to bake that. You can see that we have a little bit more detail and it's a bit more contrasty. It's a slightly different result from what we had earlier. Now on the screen, I have the exact model exported at 0.1 scale and 0.01 scale for comparison. And as you can see, we get really different results. This is something that can be confusing for beginners, and different software uses different units for measurement. I personally noticed this between Blender and Maya. So you kind of need to figure out the scale at which you need to export the objects depending on the software that you are using for the modeling. Now this issue is something that I hope can be improved upon. It's not an extreme issue. You just need to model in correct scale, which you should be doing anyway, and you can still figure out and get the result you want for the bake. But it's just a quality of life feature that would make it a lot easier to work with. For the last bake, we can do the ambient occlusion. For this, I found increasing the sample count does increase the quality by a lot. So I will set this to 64. You can go for a higher sample count by typing in the value. Same thing for the curvature. If you want a better quality, you can increase the sample count, but it will take longer to bake. Another setting I found useful is the cone angle. Here you can see the difference you get with the cone angle. I got better result by setting it to 0, as the output was similar to the ambient occlusion bake in other softwares. I'm not too sure how this technically works, but I just had better results by setting it to 0 for multiple different projects. That's it for the bakes. I'm pretty satisfied with the results we got for the maps. I took a lot of time for baking as this is the first layering tutorial on the channel and I wanted to go a bit in depth and show different results so that you can figure out the differences and pinpoint what is the issue you are facing with any incorrect bakes. One thing I do have to mention about baking is the default values don't always work, so you have to tinker with these settings to get the perfect results. Anyways, let's start texturing. I'm going to turn off the image viewer as we don't really need it right now. On the right, you have the layers tag where you can add all your fill, paint and filter layers. And at the bottom, you will get the settings for the selected layer. Let's just add a new layer and select the multi-channel layer. We have color now. Let's rename this to base. First, you have the mapping settings. So if you're using any grunge or image texture, you can change the projection mode and manipulate that here. Next, you can go to the layer channels. Here you can adjust different properties like the base color, metallic, roughness, and any other channels you wish to add from the add channel option on the left. Change the color to something gray to start with. We can also turn on roughness to control it in the base layer. With the fill, we can control the black and white range to set the base roughness. So the icon that looks like the shutdown icon means that the channel is turned off, and you can choose to use that property with an element graph resource, a fill, an image texture, or even reference another layer. We can try those out in future videos, but for this just use the fill and pick a base roughness to start with. Add another layer. Let's leave the color like this so it's easy to see. We want to create a grunge mask to break up the surface and add some noise to this. Select add mask and pick a mesh mask builder. We can get all sorts of different masks with this. Underneath the layer you can see the mask that we added, and this indicates the number of mask layers that we have attached to the layer. Below we have settings for the mask. We have the option to add a grunge here. We only have the opacity control, but when we increase it, we can see the other options. Right now, it's just black and white color for the grunge image, so we don't really see anything. We can choose to add an image from the resource library. If you have any images imported, you can also find those. Let's just try the smudges for this. And there you can see the grunge pattern take effect. So just play with the values to adjust the look. You can set the mapping for the grunge here. You can also move this using the 3D gizmos. Also scale it. So W to move and R to scale. There isn't any option for rotation with this. That's pretty much all the settings. We can adjust the opacity, speed and the balance. So now let's pick a color for this. I'm just choosing something a bit light to get that washed out look from being exposed to the sun. If you want to see exactly what the mask is doing, you can select the mask and hit S on the keyboard to solo the layer, and you can visually just see the mask on the model. Hit S again to turn off the solo layer output view. You can see that there is a bit of a noticeable seam here. This is not from the UVs but from the triplanar projection. It's where the X, Y and Z planes for the projection intersect. And you can fix this by simply increasing the projection softness. This is just softening where the different axes meet. So increasing this will fix that, but it will also make the texture blurred and washed out where it is softening. That is it for the grunge. Again, we can go and change the color later. Next, we can work with the curvature. Add a new multi-channel layer. Add a mask builder as well. This time choose the curvature and increase the opacity. It's barely visible, but we can adjust the values for this. First, you have the option for whether it affects the edges, cavities, or both. And we can just play with the different values to adjust the look. You can blur this, but this is going to cause problems where the UV seams are present. So this is what I mentioned earlier when we were unwrapping the model. So I just avoid using the blur usually. Now for the color, we can pick a much brighter color for this. You can also play with the opacity and change the blend mode for this. Right now we are in the base color channel, so you are seeing the opacity and blend mode for that. You can also change the blend mode and opacity for each channel of the selected layer on the bottom. I really like this functionality where it's right there to access instead of changing it in the drop down on the top. We can also add a grunge to break up the curvature mask. I think it looks better that way. Pick a grunge map and adjust the values. And yeah, you can experiment more with this. That will be it for the curvature. Let's name the layers so it doesn't get confusing. Add another layer. This time we will do the ambient occlusion. Get a mask builder again. We are mostly just exploring the mask builder in this video. So pick ambient occlusion and increase the opacity. Let's solo this to get a better view for the mask. Increase the balance till we start seeing something. You have all the settings that you need to adjust and play with the ambient occlusion. We can try adding a grunge to go along with the ambient occlusion as well. Just try experimenting with different noises and adjusting the values. Here I'm just trying some out. For color, we can pick something dark as it is for the ambient occlusion. And for the blend mode, we can use multiply. I actually do like the look that this has with the noise. I believe it's because I set the ambient occlusion samples to a low value when baking, but this worked out well anyways. But if you don't like it, you can just increase the bake samples and not use any grunge with this. Next, let's do some dirt. So get another layer along with the mask builder. Add the grunge and let's add an image texture. Change the color to a dark brown for the dirt. Now we can go back to the mask builder and adjust some of the values to increase the dirt coverage. Increase the projection softness to get rid of any triplanar seams. You can also try using a second grunge map. I like the spot 7 for this. I tend to use this for most of the materials. You can adjust the values to get a good blend between the two grunge maps. This looks good, but I want to remove it from the edges of the rock. So let's put the layer below the curvature mask. Actually, if you put it under the mask, it doesn't move it. This is kinda hard to see and can get a little annoying sometimes. Name this dirt. You can see the difference if we put the layer on top. Now I want to take away from the edges more. So we can do that with a curvature mask. Solo the mask layer output. Let's adjust the values and make this a bit intense. Now all we want to do is change the mask layer blend mode to subtract. So we are basically subtracting the curvature mask from the dirt mask we created below it. You can also add another grunge map to the curvature to break it up a bit. That should do it for the dirt, and we can play with the blend mode. You can adjust the opacity for all the maps. I also like to adjust the opacity once we export and see how the textures look in the other softwares. For the sake of this video, we can try a gradient map as well. However, I do like to use gradients outside of InstaMAT so that I can make it world aligned and have the rock in any orientation. So with the mask builder, we can choose the gradient and we get these gizmos to adjust the position of the two gradient points. I think this is really cool and it makes it very intuitive to work with gradients and easily adjust it. It's so much nicer to use than to just guess and try to adjust everything with the vector values. So we can adjust the contrast and the balance as well. We basically want to mask the lower part. And for the color, we can choose something a bit dark. Soft light blend mode works really well with this. Anyways, we will just turn this layer off when exporting, but I just wanted to show how to use the gradient because I think it works really well in the software. I forgot to mention that you can view any of the masks in the image viewer by right clicking on the layer or the mask and selecting view output for the current channel. Finally, let's look at exporting the textures. Again, I will turn off the gradient. So you can first see the project resolution and the bit depth. I have it set to 2K with 16-bit normalized. You can also set the bit depth for each of the channels. I like to set that to 16-bit as well, as that would allow us to adjust the color a little bit outside of InstaMAT using different adjustments like HSL or curves. We didn't really do much with the roughness, but you can add some variation with the grunge and dirt layers, so we can increase the roughness there. Anyways, not going to do much with the roughness, so we will just leave it. Let's open up the texture export window. First, we can select the location to save the textures. I will just create a new folder for it. Next, set the name for the textures, and you can see the preview for the name below. Select the image file format. Again, we have the option to set the resolution and bit depth. And these are the maps that we can export. Don't really need the AO, so just remove it. You can add any of these maps. First, add a custom output. It will be a grayscale if it is for the AO, and just drag and drop it. You can do the same for the base color, but with an RGBA output. You have different export templates, and you can create your own or duplicate the one on the top. Just hit export and we can wait for it to finish. Now we can go back to Blender and check how the textures look. Here in Blender we have the two meshes from earlier. Duplicate the low poly and add it into a new collection with them. Rename this. Now we can go to the shading tab and assign the textures. Add a new material. Make sure to go to Edit, Preferences, Add-on, and turn on the Node Wrangler add-on. With the principal BSDF selected, hit Ctrl-Shift-T, go to the location, and we can select the textures. We don't really have any information for the height map, so we can just delete that, but for now, just select the rest of them and add them. Blender should automatically set everything up properly, and there we have the rock. You can go to the material preview mode and select a different HDRI to see how it looks in different lighting conditions. Again, you can go back to InstaMAT, make any changes you want and export that. And all of the textures should be replaced. Coming back to Blender, select one of the textures and hit Alt-R. And that should reload and update the textures. You can go back and repeat that for any changes. So that should do it for the rock. I'm pretty satisfied with the results. InstaMAT layers can be a bit tricky to get used to, especially if you're coming from other softwares, and some things just work differently here. It's still a new software, so there's definitely room for improvement, especially in terms of baking with a 3D UI to see the bakes in real time. And also I wish the UI was a bit more customizable, so if you could rearrange the menus to your comfort, that would be really nice. With that being said, InstaMAT also has some unique strengths to it, especially when it comes to more advanced stuff like using element graph and layering simultaneously, and just some other features like we saw with the gradients. I would definitely say try out InstaMAT even if you use other texturing software, because I think most people can find something unique with InstaMAT that can enhance their workflow. Anyways, that's it for the video. I hope you guys found this helpful. Again, sorry for the really long video. I had to cover a bunch of stuff and make it a bit beginner friendly. If you found this video helpful, thank you for watching.